I started talking to university audiences in the late 80s about the sorts of things I've been talking to you about, particularly medical ones, and watching the processes that are going on. And of course, you can't do medicine these days without realizing that we have really, really screwed up over sex in a very, very big way. The fact that sexually transmitted disease has gone through the roof in my lifetime is beyond belief. When I was in medical school, none of the girls in the class were sexually active. This was before there was an effective contraceptive. And they were not going to give away their virginity till they had 1 and preferably 2 rings on their finger. And that was the right choice. And it made for a better world. The only person who understood what was happening to our world in this respect when the pill came along in the early 60s was the Pope at the time. And he said something which was profoundly wise, and he's been proved absolutely right, and no one has said much about it really. He said the problem with an effective contraceptive is that it will do 3 things. First, it will lead to a contraceptive mentality. Has that happened? Do men assume that women in their early 20s are on the pill and therefore safely available? Yes, they do. Second, it will lead to a general lowering of morality. Has that happened? Yes, it has. And finally, it will lead to increased disrespect for women. Has that happened? Oh, yes. The first time I met my wife, she had walked halfway across London as a university student through an area called Bermondsey, where a single white woman could not walk today. Sorry? Brixton, sorry. Same concept though, yeah. You're right. Just in the wrong bit of London. She lived in Bermondsey just to make it worse at one point, you know. The world has changed in that respect. I grew up in a blue-collar environment in Birmingham, in England, where the Industrial Revolution began. My parents had no significant education. They were working by the time they were 13 or 14. But they were basically oppressed by the British class system. But my mother was a superb teacher. I didn't realize that till years and years later. But she used to talk to women's groups in the context of the church. And she was popular all across Birmingham. So we never had a car. She would go out speaking to women's groups. And sometimes she'd be coming back quite late at night on public transport. And then it was just after the Second World War, street lighting was still not up to much. She would have a 10 or 15 minute walk through the streets of the British equivalent of Detroit, and my father never gave it a thought, because there was absolutely no risk. If any attack on a woman had happened, one scream, every door would have been open. The guy probably wouldn't have been alive to greet the police. That's a very different world, isn't it? And this primary bit that's got lost is in our misunderstanding of our own sexuality. Now, I'm going to read a little bit from Wendell Berry's book. This is a series of essays, and the one I'm going to read from is called Sex, Economy, Freedom and Community. Wendell Berry is somebody... Oh, let's check. How many people have read a Wendell Berry novel? I only see 1 or 2. That's horrendous. Well, I can do you some good. Guys, if you want a really good novel for your wife for Christmas, go and buy Wendell Berry's Hannah Coulter. Read it yourself first. To show you how good a writer he is, he can write a book about a good woman, and you can't put it down. That's real talent. Most books that make you turn pages are about bad people, aren't they? Or bad things. Wendell Berry's good enough to write about good things and write well. And he's written, in fact, a whole series of novels about an imagined community in Kentucky over the whole of the last century, basically, from the time of the horse and buggy up to the present. And basically, he's using that to trace the decline in Western society. He doesn't preach, but he's deeply committed to serious Christian understanding of the world. He doesn't go to church anymore because he can't stand what they've done to the worship. But he's someone to read. Now, he's about my age, he's a little bit older, only a lot smarter, so that he got tenure at a major university in the English department, but within a few years, he resigned that position. He realized the university was losing its way, so he went back to his roots and did what his grandfather and his father had done, grow tobacco. And write essays, poetry, and novels. And he's become something of a cult figure in many ways. If he wasn't a Christian, he'd have a Nobel Prize for Literature. One of my favorite characters of his deconstructs the faculty of education in one sentence. I actually hate the faculty of education, I hope with a righteous hatred. I hold them responsible for being the destruction of the university and of teaching. And those of you who teach, raise your hand if you can honestly say to me that what you learnt in the faculty of education, apart from teaching practice, where you were learning from the children, was of absolutely essential value to you today. No hands have gone up. That's always the case. And Paul understood it, and it solved a problem for me when I finally understood it with the help of Wendell Berry. The criteria for leadership in the church are all character traits. Have you noticed that? No skills. But apt to teach is in the list, but it's that little word apt, A-P-T, that matters so much. Teaching is not a skill. Teaching is a character trait, because it brings together two loves. And Wendell Berry does this beautifully. In his first Fort William novel is a love story about a great gawky farmer and a village teacher in the days of a one-room schoolroom. And they notice one another. They're the exact opposite of the spectrum. He can give you a picture of Ptolemy the farmer. He says, Ptolemy was a big man whose clothes looked as though they had been taken by surprise 20 minutes after they put them on. You recognize the kind of man he's talking about, don't you? But he was a good farmer, and he loved his farm, and he loved people. And you learn more about Ptolemy as you go along. Miss Minnie, on the other hand, was the little, petite, beautifully organized village teacher who ran a very tight ship. If any boy misbehaved, his father would be spoken to, due punishment would be given, and all would be well. But of Miss Minnie, he said Miss Minnie went to teachers' college where she learned many cunning techniques which she never subsequently used, because Miss Minnie loved children and she loved books, and she taught by merely introducing the one to the other. You see, homeschooling is halfway there immediately because mom and dad love the child. But you need both loves to get a great teacher. You must love the pupil and you must love the subject. And love is not something we can teach in university. That's why the Faculty of Education is a total failure, because it has confused the essential nature of education. Now, here's Wendell Berry talking about how we have got sex wrong, following what the pill did and what the inventor was proud of, that we have separated the pleasure of sex from the risk of reproduction. God joined those two things together. If we think we can separate what God has joined together and there be no consequence, we're fools. And this is, I'm just going to read a little longer than I would normally do in this context, but it's the time of day when reading a story, so to speak, is something that you would like, right? Except that this is not a story, and you might not like what he's going to say. One of the boasts of our century is that its artists, not to mention its psychologists, therapists, anthropologists, sociologists, statisticians, pornographers, have pried open the bedroom door at last and shown us sexual love for what it really is. We have, we assume, cracked the cell of sexual privacy. The resulting implication that the cell is easily cracked disguises the probability that the shell is, in fact, not crackable at all, and that what we have seen displayed is not private or intimate sex, not sexual love, but sex reduced, degraded, oversimplified, and misrepresented by the very intention to display it. Sex publicly displayed is public sex. Sex observed is not private or intimate and cannot be. Could a voyeur conceivably crack the shell? No, for voyeurs are the most handicapped of all the sexual observers. They only know what they see. True intimacy, even assuming that it can be observed, cannot be known by an outsider and cannot be shown. An artist who undertakes to show the most intimate union of lovers, even assuming that the artist is one of the lovers, can only represent what he or she alone thinks it is. The intimacy, the union itself, remains unobserved. One cannot enter into this intimacy and watch it at the same time, any more than the mind can think about itself while it thinks about something else. Is sexual love then not a legitimate subject for the imagination? Oh, it is. But the work of the imagination does not require the shell to be cracked. From Homer to Shakespeare, from the Bible to Jane Austen, we have many imaginings of the intimacy and power of sexual love that have respected absolutely its essential privacy and thus have preserved its intimacy and honored its dignity. The essential and inscrutable privacy of sexual love is a sign both of its mystery and sanctity, and of its humorousness. Have you ever thought how funny sex is? I mean, if anybody is oppressing you, just think of them making love. You want to burst out laughing immediately, don't you? Especially if they're being pompous. And God made us addicted to this behavior for good reason. It is mysterious because the couple who are in it are lost in it. It is their profoundest experience of being of the world and of being in it, and at the same time, an obliviousness to the world. This lostness of people in sexual love tends to be funny to people who are outside it. But having subscribed to the superstition that we've stripped away all privacy and mystery and sanctity from sex, we have become oddly humorless about it. Most people, for example, no longer seem to be aware of the absurdity of sexual vanity. Most people apparently see the sexual pretension and posturing of popular singers, athletes, and movie stars as some kind of high achievement, not the laughable inanity that it really is. Sexual arrogance, on the other hand, is not funny. It's dangerous. And there are some signs that our society has begun to recognize the danger. What it has not recognized is that publication of sexual privacy is not only fraudulent, but often also a kind of sexual arrogance, and a dangerous one. Does this danger mean that any explicit representation of sexual lovemaking is inevitably wrong? It does not. But it means that such representations can be wrong, and that when they are wrong, they are destructive. The danger, I would suggest, is not in the representation, but in the reductiveness. Remember that word from the beginning, one of the key problems? The reductiveness that is in the risk of representation, and that is involved in most representations. What is so fearfully arrogant and destructive is the implication that what is represented or representable is all that there is. It is the best representations, I think. There would be a stylization or incompleteness that would convey the artist's honest acknowledgement that this is not all. How many of you are fans of the BBC Pride and Prejudice series? Enough to titillate your fancy, and the rest might go and watch. But one of my favorite scenes in that is where they're not true to the text because they go beyond the text in that it's a film. And Elizabeth is turning the music pages for Darcy's sister, and they catch them, Elizabeth and Darcy, looking at one another with love for the first time and realizing what has happened to them. It's beautifully captured. It doesn't in any way intend to show you anything more than two eyes meeting, and it's beautiful. That's what Wendell Berry is writing about here. The best representations are surrounded and imbued with the light of imagination, so that they make one aware with profound sympathy of the two lives, not just the two bodies that are involved. They make one aware also of the difficulty of full and open sexual consent between two people, and of the history and trust that are necessary to make possible that consent. Without such history and trust, sex is brutal, no matter what species is involved. That's a rather long introduction, which I normally don't do, but it's also a deeply insightful one, isn't it? And women in particular are aware that the pressure in our society to make sexuality a reduced thing has to be confronted in some way. And the church is the place where it should happen. But how often is there a discussion in your church about sexuality? Does it happen with the young people every year? I doubt it. And that sexuality in the modern world has to include sexually transmitted disease. Every year, the young people in the church need to be taught what is at issue here in a very serious fashion. Now, there are a couple of books that have come out in the last year or two by Joe McElhaney and Frida Bush, one called Hooked and the other called Cover Our Girls. Joe is a friend of mine who was an obstetrician gynecologist in Texas, a very successful one. He had his own private aircraft. He was a Christian, but he hadn't been taking his faith out seriously. Then he began to be aware what the epidemic of sexually transmitted disease was doing. He sold his aircraft and he put his money into running the Medical Institute, which is a very good place to look for real information. He was aware that the sexologists and the other people have a vested interest in presenting this in a reduced way, as though we are no different from the animals. And we are very different from the animals in this respect. So in those two books, he shows how the culture is changing. What he did was brilliant. When I first said, why didn't I think of that? He's written in very basic English with little come-on bits in the page every now and again to get you to read the next page. But every important statement has a footnote which will lead you into a deeper level of literature, so that it's an access to academic literature when you need it as well. Brilliant combination. I was worried that it might be a little bit too explicit, so I actually gave a copy to my second daughter, who's a good literary critic in that sense, and said, would you give this to your family? And she said, not only would I give it, I'm going to make them read it. It's not easy reading, but it's the world we live in. And as I mentioned already in this series of 3 talks, that we are seeing the consequences left, right and centre. The first time we went to Africa in 1987, we went to Central Africa where HIV started, and the disease had only just been known. It was beginning to become known. We were there for a few months, and then on the way back, I went to South Africa to teach. This was still in the time of apartheid. The only reason I could go there was the ANC wanted me to go, because my expertise was in severe malnutrition, and that was a black problem, not a white one. And I remember going to Soweto Hospital, Baragwanath Hospital, to give a lecture on malnutrition in children. But then at the end, one of the doctors said, we've just had our first case of this new disease from Central Africa. You've just come from there. Can you tell us anything about it? So I told them what I knew. Some, 13, 14, 15 years later, we were in Bloemfontein at Christmas, which is a very conservative area of South Africa. And we were staying with a pediatrician, and she said, I want you to come and do rounds with me between Christmas and New Year, because I want you to meet my residents. So I said, I'd be delighted. I haven't done rounds for a year or two. The first ward we got to, every child in the ward was HIV positive. Every single child. And the last one to come in, who'd come in the night before, was brought in by great-grandmother. Grandmother had died of AIDS, and mother was sick with HIV. So great-grandmother was the only caregiver in the family. That, in just about 20 plus years, from nothing to that stage. Now, in parts of Southern Africa, 30% of the population are HIV positive. Nobody can pretend that that is progress, can they? There's no way. And Stephen Lewis, who was our UN representative for AIDS, ought to be ashamed of himself, in my view, because when the probability of the person you're having sex with, if it's anonymous, is 30%, and the only protection you have is a condom, which the maximum reliability is 90% and probably lower given the circumstances. If you can multiply 2 probabilities together, you are looking at a risk that no sensible person would take. And yet the only thing they have to offer is a condom. And I know, how many of you have had sex education programs at school on your way through? A good number. And let me try my standard question. Can you name the 2 sexually transmitted diseases for which a condom is no protection? Just one hand goes up. What are they? Yeah? And what? I can't hear that, but was it human papillomavirus? Because that's what it should have been. The point about both those diseases is that they are incurable. That may change, but at the moment. And human papillomavirus is responsible for over 95% of cancer of the cervix in women. It's also responsible for most of the cancer of the rectum in homosexuals and other people using anal sex. And it's responsible for cancer of the throat in male homosexuals in New York, the main cause now. That's not unimportant knowledge, is it? I think that the first question on your sex ed program at high school, and I think if you've got children in high school, you should ask if this is the first question, is name the diseases for which a condom is no protection. If you get that wrong, you take the whole course again till you get it right. Because I've asked that of fourth-year honours students in biochemistry for 20 years and never got a correct answer. That's a failure. I think it's time there was a class action suit against the sex educators because it would be easy to demonstrate this ignorance, which they were supposed to cure. Instead, they gave the lie of the condom being a solution, which is not. The reason it's not, of course, is that those two diseases are transmitted by skin-to-skin contact. You don't need penetration. There was an amazing moment at one of the World HIV conferences when a woman somehow got to the microphone before they were realizing that not everybody agreed with them. And she asked the panel, she held up a condom and said, which of you people on this panel would agree to sex with a person who was HIV positive with only this as your protection? There was a very embarrassed silence because none of them would, of course, do that. So Stephen Lewis was pushing an agenda for which there is no intellectual defense. Now, what it needs in our case, of course, is to deepen our theology of marriage. And what I'm about to say to you is not going to be pleasing to you. And when I first started talking about it, I thought, well, this is going to be the end of my speaking career. But it hasn't been, much to my amazement. As I thought my way through this, I realized that as a Christian, the Catholics are right on this issue. And I can put it to you in the form of a question. Can you coherently say to Christ, which I hope you all do, I want you to be in charge of the whole of my life? Is there anybody here who doesn't want that? No one. But it's not true. You do want that. Because if you then use the pill, you're saying, accept my fertility, aren't you? So you don't want Christ to be in charge of the whole of your life. You don't trust him with your fertility. Now, is that theologically defensible? I don't think so. Now, particularly at this stage, it's much easier than it used to be because the modern methods of natural family planning are just as effective as the pill, but they do require self-control. Only 35 or so hours per month, but that much. And one of the things that happens because of that is, yes, if you use natural family planning, you're likely to have a baby in the first 2 years, but it's not because the system failed. You see, when you say to God, to Christ, I trust you, he takes you seriously. And it's likely that he'll trust you with a baby within 2 years. And there are no surprise babies for people who are using natural family planning. Because they can tell you usually within minutes as to when it happened. And it goes something like this. You remember when you got married, those of you did, the bloom goes off the rose fairly quickly, doesn't it? I mean, Sally and I had our first row, I think, on the way to the hotel, but, you know, that's just the way we're made. We're fairly feisty on both sides. But we had made some promises in church which we intended to keep, which is the reason why we're still together. That happens to everybody. It takes a little longer. Some people have a longer honeymoon period, so to speak. But the bloom does go off the rose, and you'll say something like this, we're not doing so well, are we? Maybe we should take a weekend away, see if we can bring the romance back. And so you go on Expedia and you find a hotel you can afford and off you go. When you get there, she says, you know what time of the month it is, don't you? And of course, the first thing about natural family planning is the guy has to learn a few things. And he says, oh my goodness, it only takes a minute. How could we do this? And she says, well, you said we couldn't afford a baby. And he says, you said you weren't ready for a baby. And she says, well, maybe I am. And he said, well, I had to raise, maybe we could. Let's do it anyway. And you do, and you do. Now, I started saying this to medical students some years ago now, and I have been astonished at the response. The most beautiful one was the time I don't even remember doing it, but they assure me that I did. You remember a few years ago there was a horrible massacre at Virginia Tech when some deranged student shot about 30 students. The week before that happened, or a couple of weeks before, Sally said, "There's a space in your calendar. That doesn't usually happen at this time of year. I wonder why." Well, immediately after the shooting, I got a call from Virginia Tech the next day, I think it was, and the doctor on the other end said, "We're being invaded by grief counsellors talking somewhat rubbishy stuff. Are you by any chance available?" And I said, "Actually, I am." He said, "Get on the next plane. I'll buy the ticket." So I went, and I gave a couple of talks a day for 5 nights. And it was interesting. I mean, Sally had worked in Rwanda, and we'd had fairly intimate exposure to the tragedies of the world at various times, so I'd thought about these issues. But at some time on that trip, and I don't remember doing this, I talked to the medical students there about what I'm talking to you about now. And some 3 years later, or thereabouts, maybe 2, Ty called again and said, "It's time you came back to see us again. And I want you to come in on Thursday night because I have a special Bible study group that wants to meet you." He didn't say any more. I didn't really think about it, so I got there. When I got to this student Bible study group, there were 6 babies there. And they held me philosophically responsible for all of them. But none of them were complaining. You see, most doctors go to medical school as students, and they put off these central aspects of human existence because we're made to serve, aren't we? And the best way we learn what service is by having children. And if you go into specialist medicine, you'll be 35 before you come out the other end, by which time your wife's fertility is dropping like a stone. And you don't really want to have too many children because you'll be 60 before they can do anything significant. You know, that's ridiculous. Trust God. And in fact, that's what these kids have done. And obviously medicine's not the most difficult thing in the world to do, but it can be very psychologically painful. You do things that cost people. So you go home after a very bad day. I guarantee there's nothing like a 2-year-old to put that very bad day into perspective in 30 seconds. That's what children do. And so these young people were actually enjoying their training more than the ones who were going neurotic about memorizing everything. If you've got a family, you can't do that. You have to do it on a more rational sort of basis, and you actually do better. We are made to serve. And one of the best examples we have of service is in this area. Now, of course, if you don't have that capacity built into your system, then you start talking about gender and about means of using vocabulary to avoid what it means to be human. I mean, this conference is about being human. And one of the fundamental drives of being human is the drive for family. And it's the way, in the long run, we're going to win. Now, some of our children practice natural family planning. One of them has 9 children, but they're not complaining, and neither are we. It's a good way to be because it makes you closer to what God wants you to be. We need to rethink behavior in this area and to recognize that we are made to serve. And we should be looking for opportunities to serve because it is as we serve that we learn fulfillment. Now, my favorite way of introducing people to thinking in this way is to teach them a more sophisticated way of presenting the gospel. We actually need to do pre-evangelism, don't we? Because most people are ignorant of the story nowadays. So where do you start? When you look at students, you see what they're trying to do and where it's going wrong. So I learned how to do this from Robert Spitzer, who's an amazing Jesuit who teaches quantum physics and theology. And I listened to him, and he has a very philosophical way of doing it. And I said to him afterwards, "Robert, I want to make an earthy version of this suitable for medical students." He said, "Go ahead." And much to my delight, some years later, I got a book through the post, and it was another Jesuit who had written a book called The 4 Levels of Happiness, and it was dedicated to Robert Spitzer and myself, so it had worked. And he spends virtually every other weekend teaching another church how to do this. And I, probably to my wife's embarrassment, if she's traveling with me sometimes, I probably share this with every third person I sit next to on a plane. And I've never had anyone bail out. I always, all the way through, say, do you want to go any further? They always go the whole way. And the typical response will be, thank you, I not thought about those sorts of things ever in that way. Probably the most interesting flight I've had for a long while. Level 1 happiness, we've just been talking about, is animal happiness, which comes down to food and sex. But we are different from the animals. Animals don't know how to abuse food, and they don't know how to abuse sex. We abuse both. When you use food for reasons other than sustaining your body, you're abusing food. And when you have sex merely for pleasure, you're behaving like an animal. That's not the way it should be. Now, what I'm about to say is so profoundly countercultural. It took me a while to get around to doing it, but I don't bother anymore. But the next step in this was to embellish it a bit further, and I was sitting on a plane, and you should do these things on the outward flight after the first hub, because you will never meet the guy next to you again in your life, so it's perfectly safe. But this was flying back to Ottawa from the East Coast, and a student sat next to me. And I said to him, if you're like my class, you're sleeping around. The problem with sleeping around is that sex will become first boring and then perverted. And I waited for the explosion of disagreement. It didn't come. In fact, there was a profound silence. And then he said, wow, I've never thought about it that way, but perhaps you're right. And with a little further exploration, he came from a good family, he got to university, and he was down to one-night stands. And he's down to. It's not a success, it's a disaster. And he was honest enough to recognize that it was a disaster. Because you have separated sex from what it means to be a human being. Homosexuality, in many of its devotees, are well down this road. Over 50% of their contacts are anonymous, by self-admission. That's not good news. In fact, in London, it's got to the stage where in some of their clubs, they have a leather bag on the wall where you can relieve yourself, rather like we use with animals on the farm for artificial insemination. That's not something to be proud of, is it? That's not what God intended. When Adam saw Eve, he knew that God had done this. I wonder how long they took to find out what it was all about. A little while, I'm sure. But the intimacy was real. And that's the way it's meant to be. Those people who are living appropriately don't go for sex first, they go for intimacy. And we never received any proper training when we were growing up, and I suspect any of you of my age never had any training for what this is all about. I came from a church where none of it was ever mentioned. Much to my amazement, just a few years ago, a friend asked me, I was speaking at a conference in Uruguay, and he's from the Argentine, just south. He said, he also came from the same church background that I came from originally, and he said, my home church in Cordoba, I think they're ready for you. Would you go? And I said, sure, I'd be interested. So I went to this little Brethren church in Cordoba. And by the middle of the week, I felt very free. And instead of giving the talk that I'd prepared, I gave a talk like the one I'm giving to you now. And much to my amazement, the attention was total. And at the end of the session, a woman who must have been nearly 80 came up to me in tears and hugged me. And she said, I've been praying and asking the Lord to send someone like you to talk about this for 25 years. Thank you. And we've got to become less prudish, and we've got to become more real. And what's portrayed in the films and elsewhere is exactly as Wendell Berry says, it's reductionism. It's not what God intends. Now, because we were not well trained, we've not done a good job in this area. That's why I can talk about this, not because I did it, but because I didn't. And you pay the price forever. And watching those who do it the right way has been one of the great joys of my life, and the great What's the word I want? Well, I don't even know the word, but joy is a good one. It's rare now when I travel in the States and I'm doing a dinner meeting for the Christian Medical Dental Association down there. I do a lot of them. If I see a young couple in the audience with a baby, I know what's going to happen. They're going to come and say thank you, because if we hadn't met you, we wouldn't have had a baby yet, and we're so glad we did. Because that's what we're made for. And we have lost our way over this. The men in particular have a problem with commitment, largely because of divorce. And they're frightened that they will do the same to their children that their father did to them. And that's terrifying. So women, you've got to help them over the hump. And what happens when you start to think about sexuality properly, of course, is the first thing men and women have to learn is how different we are. I love when I get to talk to the sexes separately. Obviously, you can't do that at the moment. But in this area, we're totally different. Men are very simple creatures, and women just don't realize how simple we are. As far as this happens, it comes down to one hormone. And it's a straight line from puberty forever. So we are ready anywhere, any time, any place, if you are. The women, as even here, you're laughing at the thought of it. But and a peak hormone flow in your teens, you know, it's absolutely horrendous in many ways. We had a very beautiful technician in Jamaica. She was that amazing mixture, a little bit of Chinese, a lot of black, a little bit of white, and every time she walked down the laboratory, all the men stopped working. She was totally counterproductive to work, and she had no idea that she was. She was a lovely girl. Women, on the other hand, are quite different. They don't know what they're going to feel like till they wake up in the morning. And when you look at their hormones, you know why. They look roughly like the Rocky Mountains. So a guy who's practicing natural family planning will go home with flowers when he's done nothing wrong. It's just that time of the month when it's a good idea. We need to know one another. We are complementary, aren't we? Not only anatomically, but psychologically and every other way. We're more than the sum of our parts, aren't we, in a good marriage? That's what happens. And given the divorce rate in the church, we're clearly not doing it well, are we? So it's time for repentance and a time for more talk about this, more teaching. And of course, when we're modeling it well, we don't lose the arguments we're losing at the moment. Because of course, the standard argument for those who say, same-sex marriage is not a good idea. They say, and you can't have children. And they say, most of the time you're sterile too. And that's perfectly true, isn't it? Basically, we have brought our women folk into the stage where they are basically sterile for most of their lives. That's being pregnant without having a baby. Not a good idea. It makes them miserable compared to what they would otherwise be. So everybody loses. And most of all, we lose the argument with those who are having sex disconjoined from reproduction. We lose that. So the abuse of food and sex leads to unhappiness, one. Then you have to go up to the next level, which is the life of the mind, which gives me a moment to put in a plug for Augustine, which I've not done yet. We started this program at Augustine College nearly 20 years ago because students were going to university and being deprived of their faith because they were not prepared to answer the questions they needed to answer. And we came to realize that the only way to fix this was to teach the history of the church, the history of ideas, and show how God has worked over time to produce what he has done. And it is an amazing story. And we simply don't know it. Let me just illustrate very quickly, because that's given the time I've got, it's the only thing I can do. By telling you the biography of a man in 30 seconds, whose name you know, and you can raise your hand when you recognize it. He was born in London to a very poor family. His father was a blacksmith. What education he had was in the church. By the time he was 11 or 12, he was already at work as an apprentice bookbinder. The books he bound were, fortunately, largely science, and his boss was a good guy. He said, "You're a bright lad, you can read them." He became very interested and started going to the free public lectures at the Royal Institute and the Royal Society. By the time he was 15 or so, he knew that he wanted not to be a bookbinder, but the lab tech who set up the experiments at the Royal Institute. He'd taken very good notes of the lectures he'd been to. So he bound them very carefully and trusted them to send them to the the president of the Royal Institute, and he got the job with a few hiccups. Soon he became indispensable. Eventually he became the first president of the Royal Institute who'd never been to high school, let alone university. And he was known to stop its committee meetings so that he could get to his prayer meeting. And you all know his name, but you didn't know he was a Christian. Who is he? That's right, Michael Faraday. One or two people these days. But if that biography of Michael Faraday introduced the section on electricity in high school, would that undermine the scientism that so often gets talked there, the anti-Christian scientism? Of course it would. And I could keep you with the stories of famous Christians who committed their lives to Christ very easily. In fact, one particular stream, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Boyle, Faraday, Clerk Maxwell, all the way up to Eddington, that stream of physics is entirely dominated by Christians. That's the world we should be talking about, not the world that reduces sexual relationship and complementarity to gender. What a horrendous thing to do. That's something for verbs and nouns and things, isn't it? Not verbs, nouns, not for people. I don't have a gender. I'm a sexual being that God made that way, and I have abused it many times. And it's now 0 time, so I must stop having thoroughly ruined your day, but there we go.